black woman is driving down the street when suddenly a police car blocks her path. The officers step out, assuming she's just another civilian they can intimidate. But what happens next will leave them speechless. Thinking they can get away with harassing her, they quickly realize they've made a huge mistake. Just as they're about to escalate things, the woman pulls out her phone, makes a call, and within minutes, the scene changes completely. Her Secret Service team arrives, and the power dynamic shifts in an instant. Stay tuned to see how karma strikes and the officers regret their actions. It was an ordinary afternoon on a quiet street, cars driving by in a steady rhythm, the sun hanging low in the sky. The black woman in the car, dressed simply but confidently, was just another driver on her way to a meeting. She had no reason to suspect that this day would be anything out of the ordinary. But that all changed when the sirens went off. She glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing the blue and red lights flashing behind her. A police car had pulled up behind her, signaling her to pull over. Her heart didn't race, but she knew that these kinds of stops, as routine as they might seem, often led to unnecessary hassle for people like her. The woman pulled her car to the side of the road, rolling down her window. 2 officers approached the car, one tall and stocky, the other smaller but clearly just as eager to assert control. Neither officer smiled as they reached the window. Their eyes scanned her from head to toe, clearly sizing her up as if they had already decided she was in the wrong. "Ma'am, do you know why we stopped you?" the taller officer asked, his tone already harsh. She met his gaze, unfazed. "No, officer. Can you tell me why?" The officer continued, his words laced with suspicion. "You were speeding, and we noticed some erratic driving. Step out of the car, please." She remained calm. "I wasn't speeding, officer, and I haven't been swerving. Can you tell me exactly what the issue is?" "Don't play games with me," the officer snapped. "We're going to have to search the vehicle." The woman's composure never faltered, but it was clear that this situation was escalating. She knew the game they were playing, and she wasn't about to let them intimidate her. As she sat there, her mind was already calculating her next steps, ready to take control of a situation that had quickly gone beyond reason. The tension in the air grew thicker as the 2 officers exchanged looks. They weren't just trying to stop her car, they were trying to break her down, to provoke a reaction. The woman, calm and composed, didn't give them the satisfaction. She didn't let her guard down, even as they grew more aggressive. They asked her to step out of the car again, demanding compliance without providing any legitimate reason. She knew that if she stepped out of the vehicle, it would give them more power to escalate things further, so she stayed put. "I need you to step out of the car, ma'am," the officer repeated, now with a sharper edge to his voice. "Why? What is the probable cause?" she asked firmly, refusing to back down. Her voice was steady, but her words were laced with authority. The smaller officer stepped forward now, visibly irritated with her refusal to comply. "You don't get to question us, lady. You're making this harder than it has to be. Step out now, or we'll do it for you." The woman didn't respond immediately. She took a deep breath and kept her eyes locked on the officers. She knew that her calmness, her unshakable composure was the only thing preventing them from taking things further. But she wasn't going to let them provoke her into submission. "I'm not stepping out of my car unless you tell me exactly why I'm being stopped," she said, her voice unwavering. The officer's face reddened with frustration, and he reached for his radio, signaling for backup. The woman could feel the situation escalating, and her instincts told her it wouldn't end well if she let the officers continue unchecked. "Just stay calm. We're going to search the car," the officer said, his hand lingering near his gun holster, a subtle but unmistakable threat. The woman's mind raced for a solution. She couldn't let this slide. It wasn't just about the car or the ticket. It was about the deep-rooted bias she knew was fueling this encounter. She wasn't going to let it go unchallenged. Not today. She remained in the car, waiting for the inevitable escalation. But then she did something unexpected. Her calm demeanor changed only slightly, and she pulled out her phone. Without a word, she made a call. The officer noticed the shift in her behavior, but he was too wrapped up in his authority to be concerned. He motioned for the other officer to approach. "We've got a problem here," he muttered. "Let's get her out." Before he could act, there was the unmistakable sound of engines revving, loud and clear, just as a fleet of cars pulled up behind them. The two officers looked up in surprise. The cars were all black, unmarked, and quickly surrounding the area with military-like precision. Men and women in dark suits poured out of the vehicles, moving quickly and efficiently. The woman stayed seated in her car, her eyes fixed on the officers. The officers looked around in confusion, unsure of what was happening. The officers' confusion only deepened as the suited men and women approached the woman's car and began forming a protective barrier around her. The woman calmly got out of her car, completely unbothered by the officers. "I'll handle this now," she said simply. One of the agents, clearly in charge, approached the two officers. "You can step back now. We've got it from here." The officers stood frozen, their jaws hanging slightly open, clearly flustered. They had no idea who these people were or why they had shown up in such force. The taller officer opened his mouth to speak, but the agent interrupted him with a stern warning. "Do you realize who you just tried to stop?" the agent asked, his voice cold and professional. "You've just targeted the wrong person." The officers exchanged nervous glances, but neither knew how to react. They had no clue who the woman was, but now they were realizing that they had just made a grave mistake. The woman, who had remained silent as the situation unfolded, stepped forward, her voice calm but filled with quiet authority. "These officers stopped me without cause, harassed me without reason, and tried to escalate a simple situation into something far worse. I want to make it clear that I expect this behavior to be addressed immediately." She paused, letting her words sink in. The officers' faces were turning a shade of red now, the reality of their mistake dawning on them. They had assumed she was just another person to push around, but they had underestimated her. And in doing so, they had exposed their own ignorance and bias. The agents moved in with military precision, blocking the officers from any further interaction with the woman. The taller officer, now realizing who he had been dealing with, opened his mouth to apologize, but it was too late. The damage had been done. "Your actions are going to be reported," one of the agents said calmly, turning toward the woman. "We'll take it from here." The woman nodded, and without further comment, she allowed the agents to take control of the situation, watching as the officers were led away from the scene, their faces a mixture of shock, regret, and embarrassment. The scene outside the woman's car had shifted from one of confrontation to one of confusion and realization. The two officers, who had been so sure of their authority, were now confronted with the unmistakable power and professionalism of the Secret Service agents. The woman, standing tall and calm, had effortlessly turned the tables, and the officers were now realizing the mistake they had made. As the agents surrounded the woman, the officers looked around helplessly. The situation had spiraled far beyond their expectations, and they were at a loss for what to do. The taller officer, who had been the most aggressive during the traffic stop, started to take a step forward, trying to salvage some semblance of control. But the lead agent, standing firmly in front of the woman's car, raised a hand to stop him. "Not another word," the agent said, his voice cold and unyielding. The officer faltered, his face turning red with embarrassment. He had been so sure of himself just moments before. Now, his assumptions were crashing down around him. The woman, still composed, faced the officer and spoke calmly but firmly. "I need you to understand something," she said, her voice steady and strong. "You made an assumption about me based on nothing more than my appearance. You tried to bully me, intimidate me, and treat me as less than I am. And now, you're paying the price for that mistake." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, still unsure of what had just happened. They had been caught off guard, and now they had to face the consequences. The lead agent stepped forward, his tone authoritative. "Ma'am," the agent began, addressing the woman, "we've got it from here. This situation has been handled." The officers, now realizing the magnitude of their error, took a step back. The woman turned toward the agents, signaling them to proceed. The tension in the air was thick, but the calm demeanor of the woman and her agents seemed to bring a sense of order to the chaotic scene. The agents, now in full control of the situation, began to speak with the officers, asking questions and collecting details. The woman stood quietly, allowing the agents to handle the formalities, but her eyes never left the officers. There was no anger or gloating in her expression, only a quiet, resolute sense of authority. She had shown them exactly what it meant to be underestimated, and now they had no choice but to acknowledge it. As the agents finished their inquiries, they turned toward the officers. "We'll be filing a report," the lead agent said, "and we'll be following up with your department. You're going to be held accountable for your actions today." The woman nodded, satisfied that her point had been made. "Thank you," she said softly, though the weight of her words carried more than a simple thank you. She wasn't just thanking the agents for their intervention. She was acknowledging the power of the situation that had unfolded. The officers, still stunned, stood in silence. They had crossed a line, and now they were about to face the consequences. They had assumed that because of their badge, they could treat anyone however they saw fit. They hadn't realized that they had just wronged someone far more important than they could have ever imagined. The woman stepped back toward her car, her face remaining calm and composed. She didn't need to say anything more. Her presence, her composure, and the arrival of the Secret Service had spoken volumes. The officers would not soon forget this lesson. As the woman drove away, the agents remained on the scene, continuing to handle the aftermath. The officers were left standing there, their careers and reputations in jeopardy. The woman's quiet strength had dismantled their assumptions and shown them the power of respect and authority. The woman's phone buzzed in her hand, and she answered it. "Yes, it's taken care of," she said into the phone, her tone still calm, yet filled with satisfaction. "Thank you for your help." As she hung up, she looked in the rearview mirror and saw the officers, still standing by their cars, now stripped of their arrogance. The sight of them would stay with her, but she was not angry. She was focused. She had stood her ground, and the world would be a little more aware of the importance of dignity, respect, and fairness. The Secret Service had handled the situation, but the woman had handled the real work. She had shown the officers and the world that power is not just in authority, but in standing firm against injustice. As the woman drove away from the scene, her calm demeanor remained unchanged. But little did the officers know, the repercussions of their actions were far from over. The scene they had just witnessed wasn't the end of it. It was only the beginning. The woman wasn't just another driver with a story to tell. She was someone with connections that extended far beyond what the officers could comprehend. The mistake they had made wasn't just a small misstep. It had far-reaching consequences. In the days following the incident, news of the altercation spread. While it initially seemed like a typical case of police misconduct, it soon became apparent that the woman was far more influential than anyone had realized. The media began to report on the situation, piecing together the story of how a routine traffic stop had spiraled into a public scandal. But the real twist came when it was revealed who the woman actually was. The woman wasn't just a private citizen or an ordinary member of the public. She was a high-profile government official with Secret Service protection. She wasn't just any civilian who could be bullied by the system. She was someone who held authority and power, someone who had earned her position through years of hard work and dedication. But her calm response to the harassment had been the real revelation. She wasn't just relying on her connections to deal with the situation. She had dealt with the officers herself, showing them the consequences of their actions without needing to resort to force. Soon after, the news outlets began running headlines, detailing the officers' misconduct and the woman's powerful response. Public outcry grew as the full extent of the officers' actions became known. What was once thought to be a simple case of police overreach had now become a symbol of something much larger: the abuse of power and the need for accountability. The officer who had been most aggressive, the one who had ordered the woman out of the car and accused her without cause, was placed under investigation. His actions, which had once been dismissed as part of routine law enforcement, were now seen as a clear violation of not just professional conduct, but basic respect for others. His arrogance and assumption that he could treat people any way he pleased now came back to haunt him. Internal Affairs launched a full investigation into the department's handling of the situation, calling attention to the officer's pattern of behavior and examining whether this kind of treatment was commonplace. The officer's actions were not isolated incidents. They were part of a much larger, deeply ingrained issue of racial bias within the department. The woman, despite the chaos surrounding the incident, never spoke publicly about the matter. She knew the media was hungry for her side of the story, but she didn't need to explain herself. She had already done more than enough. Her actions spoke louder than any interview ever could. She had handled the situation with the calm and authority of someone who didn't need to prove herself to anyone. In the end, it wasn't about her. It was about sending a message that no one, regardless of their background or status, should be treated with disrespect or prejudice. While the media continued to cover the incident, more details began to emerge about the officer's history within the department. Complaints started to surface from other officers and community members who had been on the receiving end of his biased treatment. The investigation quickly grew from a single incident to a larger inquiry into systemic issues within the police force. It was clear that this wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about addressing a culture of bias and abuse that had been allowed to persist. As the investigation continued, the department began to make changes. New policies were put in place to address the issue of racial profiling and to ensure that officers would be held accountable for their actions. The woman's role in bringing this to light didn't go unnoticed. Though she remained a private figure, her actions had sparked a larger conversation about accountability and the need for reform. But the true impact of the incident became clear in the weeks that followed. The department publicly acknowledged its flaws and promised to make the necessary changes. The officers involved in the incident were placed on leave, pending the outcome of the investigation, and further measures were implemented to root out biases within the department. The woman's Secret Service team, while important in the moment, had been more of a catalyst for the larger issues at play. The true change came from her actions. She had stood up not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been mistreated by those in positions of power. Her quiet strength had sent a message loud and clear. Justice isn't about who you are. It's about holding people accountable for their actions, no matter how high their rank. As the dust settled, the woman continued with her life, the incident behind her. But the impact of what had happened lingered in the community. People began to see the power of standing up against injustice, no matter how daunting the situation seemed. The officers who had underestimated her were left to face the consequences of their actions, and the department, once blind to its own flaws, now had to reckon with the truth. As weeks passed following the incident, the fallout from the traffic stop continued to reverberate. The investigation into the officers involved was thorough and far-reaching. The officer who had aggressively handled the situation was placed on administrative leave, and a full internal investigation was launched into his past actions. It didn't take long for the department to realize that this wasn't the officer's first incident of inappropriate behavior. Complaints from other officers, as well as reports from community members, began to surface, pointing to a pattern of racial bias and unprofessional conduct. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the officers involved were not just guilty of one mistake. They were part of a larger issue that had been allowed to fester within the department for years. The woman's calm, unwavering response had exposed a deeper systemic problem, and now it was impossible to ignore. What had started as a single incident had grown into a full-blown reckoning for the department, forcing them to confront the issues of racial profiling and discrimination that they had long swept under the rug. Internal affairs worked quickly to hold the officers accountable, and soon after, the findings were made public. The officer who had been most aggressive toward the woman was dismissed from the department. His actions were seen as a violation of department policies and a clear indication that he was unfit to serve in a law enforcement capacity. But the real change didn't stop with just one officer's dismissal. The department as a whole was forced to reckon with its deeply ingrained biases and how they affected not only its officers, but also the community they were meant to serve. As part of the reforms, the department implemented new policies that prioritized anti-racism training, cultural competency, and accountability. Officers were required to attend regular workshops that focused on identifying and addressing unconscious biases, learning to de-escalate situations without resorting to force, and ensuring that all citizens were treated with respect, regardless of their race, background, or appearance. The community, too, began to feel the impact of these changes. Citizens who had previously been wary of the police now saw a shift in behavior. The department had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, there was a real effort to address the issues that had plagued their relationships with the people they were sworn to protect. For the woman, the resolution came not from the officer's dismissal, but from the changes that followed. While she appreciated the steps taken to hold the officers accountable, she knew that the work wasn't finished. This incident had revealed a much larger problem that needed to be addressed. The power of her calm resolve had forced the department to look in the mirror, and now it was up to them to prove that they could change. The woman used her influence, not just in this case, but in advocating for continued reform in law enforcement. She didn't take pleasure in the officer's downfall. She didn't seek revenge or public recognition. Instead, she saw the incident as a catalyst for a much-needed transformation. Her goal was never to destroy lives, but to create a better future where justice was the standard and respect wasn't a privilege. It was a right for everyone. The woman's identity remained a quiet part of the story. She wasn't one to boast about her role in bringing about change, but her impact was undeniable. She continued with her life, her work, and her advocacy, understanding that the true power didn't come from wielding influence, but from using that influence to foster fairness, equality, and respect in every interaction, no matter how small. She had shown that you didn't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes, the most powerful messages were the quietest, delivered with dignity and grace. For the officers involved, the aftermath was a humbling experience. They were forced to confront the consequences of their actions, and many of them began to question their own biases and assumptions. The department's changes weren't just about policies. They were about transforming the mindset of the officers. The woman's example had not just exposed one officer's misconduct, but had opened the door to a broader reflection on how law enforcement interacted with the public. The impact of this incident stretched far beyond the day it happened. It became a symbol of standing up against discrimination, a reminder that everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their race, gender, or status. And most importantly, it was a lesson in humility. The officers had made a serious mistake, but through accountability and reflection, they had the opportunity to learn, grow, and change. For the woman, this was a victory not just for her, but for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly, especially by those in positions of power. She had shown that courage and strength don't always come from being the loudest person in the room. They come from standing firm in your beliefs and making sure your voice is heard. This story is a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of standing up for what is right. It shows that when we are confronted with injustice, we have the ability to respond not with anger, but with authority, dignity, and grace. The woman in this story wasn't seeking to destroy the officers or retaliate. She simply wanted them to understand the consequences of their actions. In doing so, she forced a larger conversation about systemic racism and accountability within law enforcement. The moral is clear. Bias, prejudice, and discrimination can only be eradicated when people stand up against them, whether in the smallest or largest of situations. Change is possible, but it requires determination, respect, and the willingness to make your voice heard, no matter the odds. Strength in the face of unwarranted aggression didn't just stop at personal victory. It ignited a conversation about accountability, fairness, and respect. Her calm authority showed that the true power lies in standing firm for what's right. This isn't just a story about a black woman being harassed by the police. It's about every person who has faced injustice, discrimination, or underestimation, and stood their ground. What about you? Have you ever had to face a situation where you were wrongly judged or mistreated? How did you handle it? Share your experiences with us in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you've stood up for yourself or others in similar situations. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of resilience, strength, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Together, we can continue the fight for justice and equality for everyone. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time with more incredible stories that challenge injustice and inspire change.